donuts that are sold at farmers markets in the fall. It's baked in a bun pan, and it is essentially a giant cakey donut covered in cinnamon sugar. It's made a little bit more wholesome with the addition of whole wheat flour, olive oil, and applesauce. In one bowl, just sift together with a wire whisk 2 cups of all-purpose flour and 1 cup of whole wheat flour, organic if you can find that, and mix those together. A half a teaspoon of baking soda, a teaspoon of the best cinnamon, ground cinnamon, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and 1½ teaspoons of baking powder. Not too much baking powder. And in your other bowl, 1½ cups of granulated sugar, applesauce, 3/4 of a cup. Now, if you have freshly made applesauce, keep it in the freezer. It is one of the more popular things in my freezer because mixed with yogurt for breakfast, it's so good. The applesauce adds flavor, nutrients, and also a lot of fiber. 2 teaspoons of best quality vanilla, a cup of apple cider. Stir these together. Smells so good. And 3 large eggs. I like to just break them into a bowl and then whisk them a little bit before I add them to the batter. This cake has no butter. We're using olive oil instead, 3/4 of a cup. Get a good quality everyday olive oil. So add your eggs and your olive oil, 3/4 of a cup. Looks delicious. And then you can add the dry right to the wet, or the wet to the dry, doesn't matter. I'll just stir this in. Very easy, and I suggest that when you're baking like this, for any recipe, really make sure that you have all the ingredients on hand before you start putting things in the bowl. If you live where I live, and you've forgotten to get the apple cider, it'll take another hour or so before you can continue with your recipe, having to drive to the supermarket, which is not very close by. Now we're going to bake this in a 12-cup bun pan that's been very generously buttered. Sprinkle flour in, shake it around, and then dump out the excess. It's important to get the whole pan well buttered if you want to get the cake out in one beautiful piece. Now your oven should be preheated to 350 degrees. The cake has 2 kinds of flour, wheat flour and whole wheat flour. And the gluten in the wheat flour gives rise, structure, lightness, and elasticity to a cake like this. Generally, all-purpose is used to balance the flavors of the whole grain flours and also balance the texture. The all-purpose flour is often used to produce baked goods that are not overly dense or crumbly, as they could be if you used only whole wheat flour. Whole wheat would make this cake a little bit too dense. This will rise nicely, and you're going to bake, rotating the pan at least once during baking. It's going to take anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes to bake. Put it in the oven and set your timer. So the cake has been out of the oven for about 20 minutes or so. Let it cool before you try to turn it out. And then invert it onto a rack. This is how you invert. You put the rack on first, then you turn it over. Don't try to just turn it over. There. Let this kind of, perfect. How pretty is that? Beautiful. That's what the bun pan is famous for, these beautiful ridges, and it's going to look great when it's encrusted with a sugar and cinnamon sprinkle. Butter your cake with cooled melted butter all over the surface. This will help the sugar to adhere. It's just a couple tablespoons of butter. There. And then for the sugar, 1/4 of a cup of granulated sugar and about 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon. There's two kinds of cinnamon. One is a Ceylon cinnamon, which is also known as true cinnamon, and there's cassia cinnamon, which is usually sold and marketed as cinnamon in the United States. And they smell and taste pretty similar to one another, but the Ceylon cinnamon usually grows in Sri Lanka or southern India. And try to find that one, because that's the true cinnamon.